I never imagined that the person who brought me into this world could also be the one to shatter it completely. My name is Evan Collins, and this is the story of how my father sold my inheritance without asking me, a betrayal that would shape the next decade of my life and teach me lessons I could never have learned any other way. I grew up in a small coastal town in Oregon, a place where the ocean was both my lullaby and my nightmare. The waves could be calm, gentle, soothing me to sleep, or they could rage with a fury that threatened to swallow everything in their path. My childhood home perched on a cliff overlooking this endless expanse of water. It wasn't just a house, it was a legacy. Every beam, every floorboard, every window carried memories, not just mine, but my grandfather. He had built it with his own hands, brick by brick, plan by plan, saving dollar after dollar for a life none of us could truly imagine until it became ours. When I was 18, I received the inheritance papers. My grandfather, Harold Collins, had passed, leaving behind a 5-acre parcel of oceanfront land, and he left it entirely to me. Not my father, not my mother, just me. At first, I didn't fully grasp the significance. I felt special, chosen, trusted. My grandfather believed I would be the one to protect it, to honor it, to preserve it. That was the dream. That was the trust placed upon me. My father, Daniel Collins, however, had other plans, though I didn't see them yet. He was a complicated man, charming on good days, cold and bitter on bad. He worked odd jobs all his life, never sticking anywhere for long, never truly finding himself. And money was his weakness. He believed it could solve everything: stress, conflict, unhappiness. He wanted it more than anything else. At first, I thought he might be proud, maybe even supportive of my inheritance. But slowly, I noticed a change. He began to distance himself, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But then one summer, when I was 22, the truth hit me like a thunderclap. I had returned home from Seattle, where I was studying environmental engineering. Money was tight, life was hard, but I was learning to survive on my own. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find papers spread across the table, official, stamped, signed. My father was sitting there, reading as if nothing had happened. I picked up the documents. My heart stopped. Oceanfront parcel, Lot 2B, sold for $830,000 USD. I couldn't breathe. My inheritance, the land my grandfather had trusted to me, was gone, sold, and I hadn't signed a single thing. When I confronted him, he didn't flinch, didn't stammer, didn't apologize. He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and said, "Evan, you weren't using it. I needed the money. You'll be fine, you're young." My voice shook. "Dad, that wasn't yours to sell." "I raised you," he snapped. "I fed you, I paid for your school. I have every right to make decisions for this family." "But it wasn't a family property. It was mine," I whispered. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. "I am your father," he growled. "I don't owe you permission." The weeks that followed were unbearable. I discovered he had forged my signature. He had hidden the sale from my mother. He had spent nearly all of the $830,000, investing some in a failing business, covering debts I didn't know existed, and renovating the house he never paid a dime for. My mother cried for days, her sobs echoing through the house like a morning bell. My father didn't care. To him, it was just land, just dollars, just numbers on a page. But for me, it was everything. It was trust. It was legacy. It was my grandfather's final gift, and my father had stolen it without hesitation. I hired a lawyer, hoping to reverse the sale, to reclaim what was mine, but the property had already been legally transferred. The only recourse was against my father, and suing him, suing your own father, is a war that breaks the heart in ways the courtroom can't fix. I didn't want that war. I just wanted answers. I wanted understanding. I wanted the man I loved and trusted to acknowledge the betrayal he committed. Months passed and our relationship withered into cold silence. Each conversation, each glance, each interaction was now filled with tension and mistrust. Then came the call from my sister. "Dad says you ruined his life. He says you're ungrateful," she said. Ungrateful. For what? For having my inheritance stolen, for being lied to, for being betrayed by the man I once idolized. That was the breaking point. I realized my father wasn't sorry. He never had been. In his mind, he had every right, and that truth cut deeper than any legal battle ever could. I moved to New York, threw myself into my work, saved every penny, and rebuilt my life brick by brick. By the time I was 29, I bought my first property, not an estate, not the oceanfront land, just a modest apartment overlooking the Hudson. But it was mine. I had earned it without him, without betrayal, without the shadow of stolen trust hovering over me. Flashback life in New York was nothing like the quiet, windswept cliffs of Oregon. The city pulsed with a rhythm that never slept, sirens chatter, the steady hum of ambition. At first, it was overwhelming. Every step I took, every street I crossed, reminded me of how far I had fallen from the inheritance that should have been mine. The oceanfront land, the house built by my grandfather, the dreams my family had promised, they were gone. And yet, I had to make something of my own. I took a job at a small environmental consultancy firm. The pay was modest, the work exhausting, but it was mine. Each day I reminded myself, this was the life I was building, $1, one decision at a time. Slowly, the city became my refuge. The skyscrapers, the crowded subways, even the endless nights filled with neon lights, they became a canvas on which I could paint a life free from my father's shadow. It wasn't easy. Every month I had to juggle rent, bills, and student loans. Every paycheck came with the reminder of the land that had been sold without my consent, the $830,000 that had vanished into my father's pockets. Some nights I couldn't sleep. I'd sit by the window, staring at the lights across the Hudson, thinking about what my life might have been if my inheritance hadn't been stolen. The betrayal still cut like a knife, fresh and unhealed. But life has a strange way of teaching you resilience. Slowly, I began to find moments of peace. I met people who valued me for who I was, not for what I had or what I'd lost. There was Maya, a colleague with a gentle sense of humor and eyes that seemed to see straight into my heart. She had her own scars, her own betrayals, and somehow that made her easier to trust. Over time, her quiet support became a tether to the world, grounding me when the memories of my father's betrayal threatened to pull me under. Even as I grew, the wound of my father's betrayal never fully healed. I would occasionally find myself scrolling through old family photos on my phone, lingering on pictures of my grandfather standing proudly on the cliffside property, smiling as if he knew the land would be protected. And I would close my eyes, imagining the land still mine, imagining the life that had been stolen. Despite the pain, I pushed forward. I saved every extra dollar, working overtime whenever I could. I started small, buying a modest studio apartment that overlooked the river. It wasn't the estate I had imagined as a child, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of pride. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every book I bought with my own money was a statement. I was reclaiming my life slowly, deliberately, without depending on the man who had betrayed me. Years passed. By my late 20s, I had moved into a slightly larger apartment, one that felt more like a home than a temporary shelter. I began to invest in my career, taking on bigger projects, gaining recognition for my work. Slowly, the city became not just a refuge, but a platform for growth. I began mentoring younger colleagues, teaching them not just the technical skills of environmental engineering, but also the subtle lessons I had learned: resilience, patience, and the importance of building a life that is truly your own. Throughout this time, my relationship with my mother remained complex. She had always loved my father, and yet she had never condoned his actions. I would call her often, sharing the small victories of my life, but avoiding the painful details of the inheritance. Some nights, she would cry softly on the phone, speaking words I didn't need to hear but somehow needed to. She mourned the land, mourned my father's failings, and mourned the distance that had grown between us as a family. And I mourned with her, quietly in my own way. Years later, I received the call that would bring me back to that coastal town. "Your father is sick," my mother said, "lung cancer, stage 4. He wanted to see me. He wanted to talk. He wanted forgiveness." I went not for him, but for myself. When I saw him, frail and broken, tears forming in his eyes, I realized something I hadn't before. Forgiveness isn't about condoning what happened. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of betrayal. And that's what I needed more than anything. He whispered, "I can't give it back. I can't fix any of it." "I know," I said. "Will you forgive me?" he asked. I looked at the man who had stolen my inheritance, lied to me, and betrayed my trust, and I understood the power of choice. Forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for me. "I forgive you," I said, "but I won't forget." 2 weeks later, he passed. And I learned something vital. Inheritance isn't always money or land. Sometimes it's resilience. Sometimes it's the courage to rebuild from betrayal. Sometimes it's the strength to forgive without condoning. And today, as I stand on my own property, overlooking a city I fought to call mine, I realize that no one can steal the future I am building. Not my father, not circumstance, not even fate itself. Because what he took from me was physical. What I reclaimed, my dignity, my purpose, my resilience, was mine forever. Love became another avenue of healing. Maya and I grew closer, though I initially resisted letting anyone get too close. Trust had been broken once, and I feared repeating the mistake. But her presence was steady, comforting, a reminder that not everyone in my life would betray me. Together, we explored the city, traveled on weekends, and built a small but meaningful life. Through her, I began to understand that inheritance isn't only about material wealth. It's about the love, trust, and guidance we pass on to those who matter most. Despite the years that had passed, the thought of my father's betrayal never fully disappeared. Occasionally, I would replay the confrontation in my mind, his calm indifference, the forged documents, the casual cruelty of his words. Each memory felt like a wound that refused to scab. But I began to understand that holding on to anger only kept me tied to the past. It was a difficult, ongoing process, but slowly, I learned the art of letting go, not forgetting, not excusing, but freeing myself from the weight of his actions. Then I remembered the call that shook me all over again. "Your father is sick," my mother said, her voice trembling. "Lung cancer, stage 4. He wants to see you." I hesitated. The man who had stolen my inheritance, who had betrayed me so completely, now lay at death's door. Should I go? Should I forgive him? Could I forgive him? In the end, I went, not for him, but for me. I needed closure. I needed to see the man who had caused so much pain one last time, to confront him, to witness the frailty that comes to all men eventually. He was smaller than I remembered, frail and weak, the arrogance and anger of his youth stripped away by illness. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now soft, filled with regret he could barely articulate. "Evan," he whispered, I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but that's by the way." I continued to build my life, slowly but deliberately. I bought more properties, expanded my career, and gave back to the community in small but meaningful ways. And whenever I felt the sting of my father's betrayal, I reminded myself that he could take land, money, and opportunity, but he could not take my resilience, my vision, or the person I had become. Yet the longer I lived in New York, the more I realized that my inheritance was never just about land or money. It had been about trust, about family, about the silent agreements we make when someone chooses to hand over something precious to us. Still, life continued. Maya and I settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Our apartment overlooking the Hudson became a haven of peace and creation. I poured myself into my work, now leading projects that had real-world impact, restoring wetlands, designing sustainable urban spaces, mentoring students and young engineers. Every small victory became a way to honor the person I had been before betrayal and the person I was becoming afterward. Sometimes I would visit my mother. She was older now, her hair streaked with gray, but her spirit remained tender and resilient. We would talk about my father rarely, enough to acknowledge the hurt, but not so much that it consumed us. The inheritance my father had sold did not define me. It could not. What defined me was the life I built afterward, the resilience I nurtured, the love I allowed myself to embrace, and the forgiveness I finally offered, not to absolve him but to free myself. In the end, I understood this. Legacy is not in the land we inherit or the money we receive. It is in the character we cultivate, the choices we make, and the courage we summon when life takes what we thought was ours. My father took the land, but he could never take my resolve, my vision, or the person I had become. And that, I realized as I watched the sunset over the Hudson, was worth more than any inheritance, more than any amount of money, more than anything my grandfather could have imagined when he placed his trust in me so many years ago. I had lost much, yes. I had grieved, raged, and faltered along the way. But I had also grown, loved, and endured. And in that endurance, I found a wealth that could never be stolen, a legacy that could never be erased, and a peace that had been waiting for me all along. Because even though my father sold my inheritance without asking me, he could not, in the end, sell my future, my dignity, or the life I had the courage to create for myself. And for that, I was grateful.